The courtroom was packed that morning, every seat filled, every camera pointed, every whisper carrying weight. They said it would just be another hearing, another case filed under the endless scroll of procedural matters. But the moment Jasmine Crockett walked through those double doors, something in the air shifted. She didn't walk like someone called to defend herself. She walked like someone coming to defend justice itself. The clerk's voice echoed, "All rise." And for a moment, even those who doubted her felt the need to stand a little taller. The judge, an old man with a reputation for precision and pride, adjusted his glasses as Jasmine took her place. Her reputation had preceded her, fiery, relentless, articulate, and unafraid to call power what it was. That morning she wasn't just an attorney or a congresswoman. She was the embodiment of resistance. As the case began, the prosecutor, a man more interested in order than truth, laid out his argument. "This court," he said, "must determine whether Representative Crockett overstepped her bounds when she questioned the integrity of a judicial committee last month. Her statements, Your Honor, were reckless and disrespectful to this institution." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes turning toward Jasmine. There was silence. Not the kind of silence that fills empty rooms, but the kind that comes when everyone is waiting for someone bold enough to speak. And she did. Jasmine rose, calm, but with conviction burning just beneath her voice. "Your Honor," she began, "respect is earned, not demanded. If holding power accountable is considered disrespect, then I'll wear that label proudly." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's gavel struck once, sharply. "Representative Crockett, you will maintain decorum in this court." She met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, "decorum without truth is just silence dressed in manners." The gallery erupted, whispers, applause, shock. The prosecutor objected, but his words drowned in the echo of her defiance. The narrator paused here, looking out at the audience, as though reminding them this was not a story from another time, but a reflection of the moment they were living in now. He said, "You see, justice doesn't fear questions, it fears silence." And Jasmine Crockett refused to be silent. As the session continued, the exchange became less about her statements, and more about what her presence represented. Every question she posed turned into a mirror for the court itself. When the prosecutor accused her of being too emotional, she replied, "Emotion, that's what justice is made of. Without emotion, the law is just ink, not impact." When he called her unprofessional, she asked, "Is it unprofessional to care, or is it just inconvenient?" Her tone never cracked, but her words hit like thunder, measured, controlled, but impossible to ignore. The judge leaned forward at one point, his gavel resting still. He wasn't just hearing her, he was listening. "There's a difference," and that difference began to shape the room. In the back, a young law student scribbled notes, his hands trembling. To him, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just arguing a case. She was rewriting the language of what it meant to stand up to power. He would later say, "That was the day I realized justice could wear heels and fire in her eyes." Then came the pivotal moment. The prosecutor, visibly frustrated, slammed a hand on the table. "Your Honor, this woman is trying to change the rules," he exclaimed. The room froze. Jasmine didn't blink. She turned toward him and said quietly, so quietly that everyone had to lean in, "No. I'm reminding you what the rules were supposed to be." A single sentence, and the energy shifted. Even the judge hesitated. From that point, it wasn't just a trial. It was a transformation. Each argument she made peeled away another layer of pretense. Each word revealed how fragile the system could be when confronted by truth. The judge finally sighed, adjusting his robe as if to hide his discomfort. "Representative Crockett," he said, "this court cannot be a stage for politics." She nodded respectfully. "It isn't, Your Honor," she replied. It's supposed to be a stage for justice, but lately it feels like a script that's been rewritten to favor the powerful. Silence again. This time, even the cameras seemed to stop blinking. The narrator's tone deepened. That was the moment, the very moment when she changed the rules. Not by force, not by defiance, but by reminding everyone in that courtroom that justice doesn't belong to those who write it. It belongs to those who fight for it. By the time the session ended, the judge's ruling hardly mattered. Something larger had been decided in the minds of everyone present. She had shifted the narrative, reframed the debate, and dared the system to look at itself. As she left the courtroom, reporters swarmed her with questions. "What do you have to say about the judge's reprimand?" She smiled faintly and said, "I didn't come here to win a case. I came to remind the court what winning means." That night, her words echoed across newsrooms, social media feeds, and dinner tables across the nation. Some called her reckless, others called her revolutionary, but one thing was certain: no one called her silent. The narrator closed the first part with a reflection. History doesn't always change with verdicts or laws. Sometimes it changes when one voice refuses to echo and instead becomes thunder. News broke before she even stepped out of the courthouse. Every network, every podcast, every scroll of social media, all carrying the same headline: Congresswoman confronts court. Jasmine Crockett sparks legal firestorm. Cameras followed her every step that afternoon, but Jasmine didn't walk faster. She moved through the chaos the same way she had moved through that courtroom, deliberate, grounded, unafraid. While the world argued about her tone, her words, and her defiance, inside those walls something else was happening, a quiet reckoning. The judge who had scolded her sat alone in his chambers, staring at the court transcript. Line after line, her statements read less like rebellion and more like truth wrapped in courage. He whispered to himself, she wasn't wrong, just unafraid. By the next morning, the courthouse was a different battlefield. The prosecutor came armed with new motions, the defense team prepared for scrutiny, and the gallery was packed tighter than before. Even the hallways hummed with expectation. The narrator's voice deepened. When truth collides with tradition, the sound isn't silence, it's thunder waiting to be heard again. As Jasmine entered, the murmurs began. Reporters whispering, students recording, activists waiting to cheer or condemn. But she didn't look left or right, only straight ahead. She wore the same suit as yesterday, almost as if to remind everyone that she hadn't come to play dress-up for justice. The judge cleared his throat. Representative Crockett. He began, his tone softer. Today's proceedings will continue. You may call your first witness. Jasmine nodded, her face calm but fierce. Thank you, Your Honor. I call the system itself. A few people laughed nervously, thinking she was joking. But she wasn't. Let me explain. She continued. The system is on trial today, not because it's broken, but because it refuses to heal. We are here to decide whether accountability applies to all, or only to those without power. The prosecutor rose instantly. Objection, grandstanding. The judge hesitated, and then, for the first time, overruled him. Overruled, proceed. The courtroom froze. The rules, indeed, were beginning to change. Jasmine stepped forward, pacing slowly before the jury box. Her words were measured, but magnetic. When a citizen questions authority, we call it free speech. When a woman in Congress does it, we call it disrespect. Tell me, where in the Constitution does it say respect means silence? The prosecutor slammed his files closed. She's turning this into a performance, he shouted. Jasmine turned toward him, her voice steady. No, sir, I'm turning it back into justice. The narrator interjected, and with that one sentence, the courtroom became something else. It wasn't just a place of law anymore. It was a stage where history was rewriting its own lines. The judge leaned forward, his hand on the gavel, but unwilling to strike. For the first time, His eyes held not judgment, but curiosity. "Representative Crockett," he said, "do you believe the court has failed?" She paused. "Not failed," she answered softly. "Forgotten. Forgotten what? That justice was meant to serve people, not protect reputations." A hush fell so deep, even the hum of the ceiling fan felt loud. Outside, crowds had gathered, some holding signs of support, others chanting for her censure. To one side, a young woman shouted, "She's breaking protocol." Another replied, "No, she's breaking patterns." Back inside, the judge's patience began to wear thin again. "Representative Crockett, are you implying this court is corrupt?" She took a deep breath before replying. "I'm implying this court, like many others, has become too comfortable with injustice that looks polite." The words hit the air like lightning, not loud, but unavoidable. The prosecutor rose again. "Your Honor, I move for a formal reprimand of the witness forth." But the judge raised a hand. "Sit down, counselor." A wave of disbelief spread across the courtroom. It was clear Jasmine wasn't just arguing a case anymore. She was shifting the balance of power, one sentence at a time. The narrator continued, his tone low and deliberate. "There are moments in history when rules bend, not because someone breaks them, but because someone reminds us they were written wrong to begin with. This was that moment. Hours passed, the hearing stretched into the evening. Reporters outside traded notes, anchors rehearsed their headlines. And still, inside that room, the debate pulsed like electricity. When the judge finally called for a recess, he looked almost relieved. But as he rose, Jasmine spoke one last time softly, but it carried across the entire courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, "if defending truth means disrespecting tradition, then I accept the charge." She gathered her papers, turned, and walked out, her heels echoing against the marble floor like the ticking of a new clock starting its count. That night the nation split in two. Some called her dangerous. Others called her the voice they'd been waiting for. But no matter the opinion, one truth became clear. Jasmine Crockett had not just walked into court, she had walked into history. In the days that followed, the judge requested a private meeting. No cameras, no recorders, just two people and a conversation history would never officially document. He looked tired but sincere. "Representative Crockett," he began, "you made me rethink everything I thought I knew about order and respect." She smiled faintly. "And I realized something too, Your Honor. Respect isn't obedience, it's courage." He nodded slowly. "For what it's worth," he said, "maybe we both changed the rules." The narrator's voice softened as the story reached its close, and so it was the day Jasmine Crockett walked into court and changed the rules. Not by shouting, not by chaos, but by daring to speak the truth where truth was too long considered inconvenient. He paused, then concluded, "History doesn't remember who followed the rules. It remembers who rewrote them for the better." The next morning, America woke up divided and electrified. Every news channel had her face on the screen. Some called her a hero, some called her a headline, but no one dared call her silent. Cable debates flared up. Was she right to confront the court? One anchor asked. A panelist scoffed. She disrespected the robe. Another fired back. No, she respected justice enough to challenge what the robe had forgotten. Across living rooms, phones, and classrooms, people argued, replayed clips, quoted her lines, and tried to decide what side of history they were on. Inside the Capitol, things were far more uncomfortable. Several committee members gathered behind closed doors, their voices sharp and restless. "She's creating a spectacle," one said. "She's making us look weak," another muttered, but a quieter voice in the corner said, "Maybe we are weak, if one woman's truth can shake us this much." For the first time in years, a congressional representative's courtroom appearance had sparked a national moral debate, not about policy, but about principle. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett sat in her office, the blinds half, closed against a sea of flashing cameras. Her phone buzzed endlessly. supporters, critics, journalists, even strangers leaving voicemails that began with "You don't know me." But her staff urged her to hold a press conference. "Let's clarify your intentions before they twist it," one aide suggested. Jasmine looked up slowly, eyes steady. "Truth doesn't need clarification," she said. "It just needs repetition." The narrator's tone deepened, wrapping each word in slow gravity. She didn't chase the spotlight, it chased her, because real defiance doesn't come from anger. It comes from clarity. By midweek, the courtroom incident had a name. They called it the Crockett confrontation. Clips of her saying, "Decorum without truth is silence dressed in manners," had been replayed over 10 million times. Students printed it on protest signs. Professors debated it in ethics classes. Even judges' associations issued statements, some condemning, others commending her courage. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a question that echoed through the nation's conscience. Can respect coexist with truth, or must one always bow to the other? When Jasmine returned to court for the next session, the atmosphere had changed again, but this time it felt heavier. The judge entered quietly, his usual air of authority tempered with something new, reflection. The prosecutor was tense, aware that the world was watching. And Jasmine, as always, was calm. The narrator described the scene with cinematic detail. She stood in the same courtroom, at the same table, but this time she wasn't just a defendant or a representative. She was a symbol, and symbols make even the strongest walls tremble. As the gavel struck, the judge began, "Representative Crockett." He said carefully, "This court has reviewed the statements and conduct from the previous hearing, and while the court maintains the importance of respect within its chambers, it also acknowledges greater truth behind your words." The prosecutor shifted uneasily. "Your Honor," the judge raised a hand. "No interruptions. This is not a day for winning or losing. This is a day for understanding." He turned back toward Jasmine. "You said decorum without truth is silence dressed in manners." He paused. "I believe you were right." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The narrator leaned closer into the microphone of imagination, and just like that, the walls that were built on pride began to crumble under humility. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat, she simply nodded. "Your Honor," she said softly, "sometimes justice doesn't need an argument. It just needs to be reminded why it exists." The judge exhaled. "In that spirit," he said, "this court is revising its conduct code. Effective immediately, the right to question the integrity of process without personal attack shall not be deemed contempt." It was a small rule on paper, but symbolically it was seismic. The room was silent, and yet it roared. Outside, as word spread, people poured into the streets. Placards read, "Courage is contagious." She spoke, and the system listened. The gavel heard the people. Reporters swarmed her as she exited, shouting over one another, "Congresswoman Crockett, what does this ruling mean to you?" She stopped, looked straight into the cameras, and said, "It means justice," heard its echo, and finally answered. That clip went viral in minutes. For once, a courtroom statement felt like a national poem. Across the country, young activists quoted her words. Veteran judges privately admitted they'd been reminded why they'd taken the bench. And somewhere in a small-town classroom, a teenage girl wrote in her notebook, "One day I'll walk into a courtroom like Jasmine Crockett did." But not everyone celebrated. The backlash came swift and loud. Certain networks labeled her disruptive. Commentators accused her of turning justice into theater. She didn't respond. Not with tweets, not with interviews, because she understood something most didn't. Silence, when chosen, can be more powerful than 1,000 press releases. The narrator's tones softened. She had already spoken, and when truth has been spoken, explanation becomes optional. Weeks later, a congressional hearing was convened to discuss decorum expectations for public officials. Many expected her to apologize. When it was her turn to speak, Jasmine adjusted the microphone and began simply. I didn't come to apologize for raising my voice. I came to ask why so many stayed quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. Even her fiercest critics couldn't look away. She continued, respect is not silence. Respect is honesty. And I will never confuse the two. Not in this chamber, not in any court, not in this lifetime. The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was long. The narrator closed the part with a line that echoed like the gavel itself, and so it was, the nation that once judged Jasmine Crockett learned to judge itself. The courtroom had its verdict, but history had its own, that courage, even when inconvenient, is the truest form of respect. The cameras had long packed up. The reporters had gone home, and for the first time in weeks, the courthouse steps stood empty, just marble and echoes of history. Inside her office, Jasmine Crockett sat alone. The hum of a lamp filled the silence where the world had once been shouting her name. Stacks of letters covered her desk, some typed, others handwritten in shaky cursive. Messages from strangers, veterans, teachers, mothers, students, people who said she had reminded them that courage still had a heartbeat. But she didn't open them right away. She just stared at them, tired but not broken. The narrator's voice came soft, like memory itself. Every revolution leaves its echo, and every echo leaves a cost. Her phone buzzed with another call, her assistant's voice gentle but worried. Ma'am, the networks are still debating your statement. They're calling for interviews again. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her gaze on the window where raindrops streaked the glass. Let them debate, she said quietly. I've already said what needed saying. There was a pause on the line. Are you okay? Perhaps the call mark is CONGRE, pars of a SSWOMAN. A faint smile crossed her lips. I'm tired, she admitted, but it's a good kind of tired. The kind that comes after you've finally stopped pretending to be small. Outside, thunder rolled softly. The city that had roared with her name now whispered it in gratitude and controversy. Everywhere she went, grocery stores, airports, sidewalks, people stopped her. Some hugged her, some argued with her. But all of them knew her. That was the strange part of being brave. Anonymity was the first thing it took from you. The narrator continued, history celebrates courage in headlines, but it forgets the quiet hours that follow, the ones where the hero wonders if she's done the right thing. That night, Jasmine sat at her kitchen table, the TV on low. A news segment was replaying her courtroom moment yet again. They called it The Day Justice Blushed. She watched herself on the screen, standing tall, her words sharp and unyielding. It didn't feel like her anymore. It felt like someone she used to be, a version of herself carved from adrenaline and belief. She turned the volume down and whispered to herself, did I change the rules or just survive them? Later, she found herself flipping through a small notebook, her old law school journal. On one page, her younger handwriting read, never mistake silence for respect. She smiled faintly. I guess I was always that girl, she murmured. The narrator's tone turned warm, as though guiding the listener closer. She had learned something most never do, that speaking truth to power will shake the world, but it will also shake you. A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was her mother, visiting from out of town, a woman with soft eyes but the same steel in her spirit. She stepped in, carrying a cup of tea. They're still talking about you on the news, her mother said. Jasmine chuckled softly. I can't seem to escape myself. Her mother placed the cup down. You didn't escape, Jasmine. You arrived. Jasmine looked at her, speechless for a moment. Then her mother added, you know, your father used to say rules aren't sacred, justice is. I think he'd be proud. Jasmine nodded slowly, her eyes misting. I hope so. Some days I wonder if I went too far. Her mother shook her head. No, baby, you just went far enough for the ones who couldn't. The rain outside thickened into a downpour. Jasmine stood by the window, watching lightning ripple across the city skyline. In the distance, She could see the courthouse, its dome glowing faintly under the stormy sky. The same courthouse that once judged her now carried her name in its archives, its walls slightly wiser because she dared to question them. She whispered, almost to herself, "Justice isn't about winning, it's about waking up." The narrator spoke over the rhythm of rain. She had changed the rules, not by rewriting the law, but by rewriting its spirit. And though the world had moved on to its next argument, she carried that day like a scar and a crown, equal parts pain and pride. Later that week, she attended a community forum in a small neighborhood hall. No cameras, no microphones, just folding chairs and people who cared. An elderly man stood up and said, "Ma'am, I don't understand politics, but I saw what you did, and for the first time I believed that the law might actually see people like me." Jasmine didn't speak right away. Her eyes glistened, and she simply nodded. Then it was worth it. She whispered. That moment, simple, human, and quiet, was worth more than any applause in the Capitol, because courage, she realized, isn't about noise. It's about echo, and her echo had reached further than any microphone could. The narrator's voice slowed into a reflective close. She walked into court to defend herself, but she walked out having defended something far greater, the right to question, the right to feel, the right to refuse to bow. He paused, then added softly, "And in the end, the only thing that ever truly changes the rules is truth spoken without permission." As the final line settled into stillness, Jasmine turned off the lights in her office one last time that night. Her reflection caught briefly in the window, strong, tired, but unshaken. And outside, beneath the sound of fading rain, the courthouse lights flickered, as if even the building itself had learned something from her. Years passed. The headlines faded, the courtroom transcripts gathered dust in digital archives, but her words, those few defiant, fearless words, never stopped echoing. In classrooms they were studied, in rallies they were chanted. In quiet conversations between young women dreaming of law school, they were whispered like a promise. Decorum without truth is silence dressed in manners. The day Jasmine Crockett walked into court had ended long ago, but what she carried out of it would outlast her lifetime. The narrator's voice came low and steady, like a sermon for the soul. History doesn't remember the noise, it remembers the note that stays, and her note stayed. 5 years after the confrontation, a new generation of law students gathered in a hall named after her, the Crockett Center for Constitutional Integrity. On the wall behind the podium, her quote was etched in stone, "Justice should not be comfortable, it should be correct." A young woman took the stage, nervous and trembling. She looked out at the audience and said, "I wasn't alive when Jasmine Crockett faced that courtroom, but I've watched the footage 100 times, and every time I don't just see her, I see all of us." The crowd applauded. Somewhere in the back row, a retired judge, the very same man who once presided over Jasmine's case, smiled faintly and wiped his eyes. The narrator continued, "Change, when done right, humbles even those who once resisted it." That judge had gone on to teach law himself, and in his lectures he would always remind his students, when the law forgets its humanity, remember Jasmine Crockett. In Congress, a resolution was quietly passed in her honor, one that reaffirmed the right of every public official to challenge institutional bias without fear of reprimand. It wasn't revolutionary in wording, but it was revolutionary in meaning, because buried between those lines was her legacy, a line of courage carved into the system she once stood before. But Jasmine never sought the spotlight again. She continued her work, traveling from city to city, mentoring young voices who wanted to make change without losing themselves to it. When asked once in an interview why she rarely spoke about the trial anymore, she smiled softly, because it was never about the trial. She said, "It was about the mirror that moment held up to all of us." The narrator's voice warmed with reverence. She had not just changed a courtroom rule. She had changed the definition of justice from obedience to awareness. One evening, years later, Jasmine was invited to deliver a keynote speech at a global summit on law and ethics. It was her first public address in a long time. When she stepped up to the podium, the crowd rose to their feet. Flashes lit the room, but she didn't flinch, not anymore. She began slowly, her voice calm but commanding. I once stood in a courtroom where I was told to be silent for the sake of order. But I learned that order without truth is just comfort disguised as law. Her words rolled through the audience like a wave. She paused, then looked directly at the cameras. Justice is not about who sits higher. It's about who stands longer. The applause was thunderous. But she only smiled quietly, humbly, like someone who knew applause fades, but principles don't. The narrator leaned in again, as if telling a secret meant for hearts, not ears. History has a way of forgetting faces, but it never forgets courage. And that day, the day Jasmine Crockett walked into court, courage had a face. Outside the summit, a young reporter stopped her for a quick question. Congresswoman Crockett, when you look back on that day, what do you remember most? She thought for a moment, then said, I remember the silence right before I spoke, and realizing that silence is where fear hides. So I spoke, not to win, but to make fear step aside. The reporter lowered her mic, visibly moved, and Jasmine, as always, walked away unhurried, as if history was just another hallway she already knew her way through. The narrator's tone grew poetic, as if closing a film, and somewhere tonight, a young woman is rehearsing her first courtroom argument. Somewhere, a man in a black robe rethinks the word respect. Somewhere, a child watches the old footage of that trial and decides truth is worth the risk, because courage doesn't end in applause. It continues in echoes, in eyes, in generations who inherit the sound of bravery. And as the story comes full circle, the narrator delivers the final words, slow, deliberate, unforgettable. She didn't walk into that courtroom to be remembered. She walked in to remind justice of its reflection, and in doing so, she changed the rules not just for the court, but for every soul that still dares to stand where silence once ruled.